Hello everyone, welcome to another video in this series about implementing domain-driven design in our Flutter applications. This video is the second part of the previous video where we are looking at implementing our data source, and in this case using sqflite as our database technology. In this video, we'll finish implementing our data source, but we'll also do a couple refactorings and also implement the other parts of this infrastructure layer, so that in the next set of videos, we can move into implementing our presentation layer and tying the application together. So in the next set of videos, we'll be looking at implementing our UI and our view models and tying everything together. So the first thing I want to do in this video that we did not do in previous videos is to implement our bookshelf repository and also a use case to create a new bookshelf. So I'm also not going to be using the test first approach in this particular video. So I'll jump right into it, into our repository folder, and now start implementing the shelf repository. So I'll create our shelf repository. And this will implement the iShelf repository from our domain layer. We're not going to need the update method, so I'll quickly refactor this interface to get rid of the update method. So we'll implement our shelf repository, which will use the data source. And we'll inject it into the constructor. Now, what I'm doing here is not the ideal approach, because I am using the same data source in the shelf repository as well as the book repository. And therefore, these two repositories are now exposed to details that are not necessary or that are not supposed to be used by them. So the better approach would be to create two separate data source contracts or interface that would be used by the shelf repository and the book repository, that would encapsulate the methods necessary for those. But for now, we're just going to use the same data source interface. I'm also going to refactor this add method to call it create instead of add. There we have it. So how we'll implement the create method is by creating a new shelf model based on the ID of the bookshelf. Bookshelf ID. And then we'll say the data source and in the data source we'll create a method, create shelf, that will accept the shelf model to create the bookshelf. So we'll go to our data source and quickly create those interface methods. So we'll create 3 methods, one for creating the shelf, one to find a shelf, and also one to find the books that are associated with that particular shelf. Now we need to create the shelf model, so we'll go here into our models folder and we'll create our shelf model. In our shelf model, we'll have a single ID. We'll create the factory method also that will create a shelf. Create a shelf model from a given map. And we'll also create a toMap method that will return a map from the fields, in this case the ID in the shelf model. So shelf ID would be the string representation of the ID. So there we have our model. So now back to our data source interface, we'll import that. And now back to our shelf repository. Also import, and we'll say await. So now to find shelf, our find method should return a bookshelf. So again, let us refactor that method. Well, here we go. In our repository rather, to say return a future bookshelf. Then here we'll return a future bookshelf. So first we'll fetch the shelf from the database. So we'll say our data source find shelf. We'll pass it the shelf ID. And then if that was found, then we should use that shelf ID to find the list of books that are associated with that shelf. So I'll create a list of book model and I'll call it books, and I'll initialize it to an empty list. So books would equal to await data source, and I'll say find books on shelf, and I'll pass it the shelf ID. So now from this I'll construct the bookshelf entity, right? So I'm gonna say bookshelf equal a new bookshelf entity, and I'll pass it the ID, which is shelf ID, and then I'll say I'll get each book's return for each book, and I'll say this bookshelf entity and call the add book method. So now I create a bookshelf entity and add all the books associated with that particular shelf, and now I'll just return that, and that is my find method in my bookshelf repository. So now I'll go back to my data source implementation, and I'll import those shelf methods that were added, and I'll now implement those. So for the create shelf, I will just return the DB, and I'll insert into the shelf table the ID. Rather, it should be to map. So this is where a new shelf will be inserted into the database based on the ID of that shelf. Next, I'll say find books on shelf. So to implement this one, I'll query the books table and there should be a where clause, right? So I should query the books table where the shelf ID is equal to the shelf ID passed here. So I'll query the books table where the shelf ID is equal to shelf. And then from that, I'll create from that list, I'll create a list of book models and return that. So this should fetch all the books that is associated with the shelf based on the shelf ID. So now the find shelf method should query the DB, the shelf table, for this particular shelf ID. So we query the database for the shelf where the shelf ID matches the one that is passed in, and then we expect this query to return a single row since shelf ID is unique. Therefore, we'll return the first item in the list of maps. So now we have implemented those three methods in our data source that has to do with the bookshelf entity. So now fix these error quickly, and also I'll remove this update method here in this test. So now we clear that error. So also another error here in our add book use case. There's no longer any update method, so we'll clear that. We'll pass the bookshelf here into the output to get the ID from that bookshelf. So here I'll say bookshelf ID as a part of the output. So now we have refactored this add book use case. Now we'll create another use case to create a bookshelf. So inside our boundaries, we'll say create shelf, and we'll have a I create shelf use case for abstraction. I create shelf use case, and it should return a create shelf output. And there shouldn't be any input. And now I'll create this output also. So create shelf output. And this class should have an ID and return in the shelf ID. A single ID. Just quickly import this. And now we'll create the use case. So in our use cases, we'll say create shelf use case. We'll implement the I create shelf use case method and contract or interface, override the method, and we'll accept a repository, bookshelf repository, and also the entity factory. And we'll inject those into the constructor. So my shelf repository and also my entity factory. This should be future. So now we want our execute method to create a bookshelf using the entity factory. New bookshelf, and then we use our repository shelf repository to create that bookshelf, and we'll return the output from that bookshelf, which will be the ID. So now we have our create shelf use case. And so we have done some refactorings. We have added the methods in our data source for dealing with our bookshelf, for creating a shelf and for finding the shelf. And so we have now created everything that is associated with the infrastructure layer. So in our next set of videos, we'll be looking at the presentation layer, namely creating the Flutter UI and also our view models. So thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next videos. Remember that the code is on GitHub, so you can check out the code anytime to go through and see at your own pace. Thank you.